the bell has rung. So get seated and join Elementary Schooled for today's interview.
This is Melanie Whipple from Elementary Schooled. I really like the IXL online learning program, and I'm not just saying that because they're now sponsoring this podcast. I genuinely like it and use it in the classroom and also for tutoring students. One thing I appreciate is this program is engaging and interactive for students, yet it's not too distracting with graphics and different bells and whistles, so the students can actually stay focused on the concept they're learning. Thank you, IXL Online Learning, for what you are doing for students. Welcome to Elementary School. This is Season 2, Episode 6, and I am delighted to have Dr. Stuart Ablon with us today, founder and director of Think Kids in the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital. And I don't know if you ever tire of this, but you've accomplished so much. And so if you'll just bear with me while I read a little bit about you. I know that might be a little bit uncomfortable, but it's good for listeners to know what you've done and what you're about. You received your doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of California at Berkeley and completed your training at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. You are a top-rated keynote speaker. You teach educators, parents, and professionals and leaders of all types a very different approach to understanding and addressing challenging behavior of all types. You are author of 3 books. Has that changed? Have you added more since this list?
Not anymore.
3 is plenty. Changeable, The School Discipline Fix, and Treating Explosive Kids, the collaborative problem-solving approach, which is what we are talking about today. And let's not leave out that you are a proud father of 3 kids.
Correct.
What ages are your children?
They are. Might be the toughest question you asked me. All right, they are 24.
Oh, wow.
21 and 17. So yes,
okay.
Only one still at home, one in college and one out on his own.
Okay, so you'll have to add that you've raised 3 kids, basically. I mean, it's never done, right?
I was going to say it's never really done, right?
You're never
quite done being a parent or a child for that matter.
Yeah, that's the truth. But what a joyful, I always say to people, parenting is the most wonderful, awful experience, right? Because you experience so many different emotions, you invest so much, but it is a joy to see your kids getting raised and being successful, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, it is undoubtedly always challenging and incredibly rewarding at the same time, for sure.
Thank you for accepting the invitation so graciously and sharing your time with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
The reason I wanted to talk to you is because I heard your TED Talk about this during a time where I had what I would describe as one of my most challenging, I use the word tricky, one of my trickiest students that I've ever had was a time when I heard your TED Talk about how to reach a very challenging child with challenging behavior. And that is what it is. The child isn't challenging, their behavior is challenging. Did I say that? Does that meet the quality?
You got it. Correct.
So let's start with that. You say kids do well if they can.
Yes, that's the kids do well if they can is the underlying philosophy behind this work, which, on its own may not seem that powerful, but when you sort of explain it to people, they realize the importance of it. Because what kids do well if they can means is if a kid could do well, they would do well.
Yeah.
And that stands in contrast to the notion that kids do well if they want to, which suggests that if a kid isn't doing well, they must not want to, which then leads us to try to make them want to do well, which is, I think, where most people go wrong when it comes to forms of challenging or concerning behavior, because we assume that it's just a sort of a lack of motivation that's giving rise to the behavior, and that more often than not really misses the mark.
Do you think that idea that kids aren't choosing to do well, do you think that's more of an old school mentality, or do you still see it as you travel? Because I know you travel everywhere.
I think it's both. I think it is more old school. It's what I refer to as sort of conventional wisdom, which tends to be passed down from generation to generation and dies hard. And we still believe things a long time after they've been disproven generally. And the notion that, kids do well if they want to, we just got to make them want to. That's been disproven now, really from decades ago, by all the research we have in the neurosciences. But, that idea still sticks around. So I've seen a lot of progress. I think kids and their behavior are understood through a much more compassionate, accurate lens these days. And at the same time, I still see plenty of folks who really misunderstand what causes challenging behavior. And honestly, the biggest thing I see is I still see our overwhelming reliance on motivational procedures to try to change behavior regardless. We even when people's mindset shifts, people don't know what to do instead of whipping out their rewards and consequences. When I say people, I mean parents like you and me, and teachers. School discipline hasn't changed a ton despite all the progress we've made in understanding why some kids struggle to manage their behavior.
Yeah, that's excellent. You are so right about that. And I even have moments still in the classroom where I think, I know I have this knowledge base, but you can get kind of stuck in a moment and kind of just have this go-to thing with an incentive or something that is just going to be temporary. And you're doing it when you're doing it.
Yeah, well, and not only is it temporary, it actually may make matters worse in the moment.
Sure.
But I think, Melanie, the reason that the smart part of your brain knows what to do, but you don't do it still, is because one of the biggest factors involved here is, when we adults are confronted with challenging behavior, we ourselves get very worked up. We get, we feel disrespected. We feel like our authority is being challenged. We feel ineffective. And when those things happen, we, reach for power and control to try to regain our footing. And when we do that, we reach back for, rewards, consequences, things that allow us to sort of leverage the power differential we have over kids, which, as I said, oftentimes not only don't work, they can actually make matters worse too. Let's remember, the idea that any child would like being on the receiving end of what happens when you exhibit a lot of concerning, challenging behavior is sort of silly. I mean, this notion of kids do well if they can, which we teach, behind that is just the awareness that, all kids want to do well. I mean, show me a kid who prefers doing poorly to doing well, just like show me a teacher or a parent who prefers doing poorly to doing well. All kids would prefer to behave in a way that makes adults, pleased with them, and parents proud, and teachers proud, and everybody happy with them. If they could, they would. And, if they're not, I think what our big contribution is saying to people, look, let's follow all of the research over decades now that shows us if a kid is struggling with their behavior, this is about skill, not will. And that's a basic principle of this work. That's what we've learned over the years. Behavior is determined much more by skill than it is by simply will.
Yeah, I love that phrase that you've coined. Students and kids in general lack the skill, not the will. Yeah, I love that. So you say pick a problem we have with anyone, and we have 3 plan options. Will you walk us through these plans? Because this is what really spoke to me. So if we're really kind of cutting to the chase, we're going to talk about plan A, plan B, and plan C. And I love this and how you lay it out.
Sure. Well, first, I just want to point out that nothing that you and I are going to talk about here, these sort of techniques, it's not magic. It's not going to be effective,
right,
unless you are willing to open yourself up to the notion that students do well if they can, and that this kid whose behavior is really challenging, disruptive, et cetera, in the classroom is about skill, not will. Because until you have some empathy for the child and aren't sort of looking to simply motivate them to change their behavior, until you have that awareness, that epiphany, what we're going to talk about the rest of the time isn't going to be terribly effective, because there's no magic out there. It's about building a relationship with a student, and a student feeling understood and safe to express their concerns and work together with you. Having said all that, yes, pick any problem you have with any student, any person in the world, and what we'll tell you is you only got 3 options for how to handle that problem. We didn't invent these 3 options. They've existed since the beginning of time. We just gave them labels, as you alluded to. We call it plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. We call it Plan A when you try to impose your will to make the student do what you want them to do, which is the most popular adult response to challenging behavior, which is curious because it's not the most effective and oftentimes makes matters worse, but it is the most common response, trying to either nicely, gently, or harshly impose your will to make the kid do what you want them to do. That's Plan A. We call it Plan B when you try to solve the problem collaboratively with the student. And this is an important phrase here, not just solve it together with them, but solve it together in a mutually satisfactory way. We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
And then we call the third option Plan C. Plan C is when you decide, you know what, I'm going to drop my expectation just for now, or I'm going to
temporarily dropping it.
Just for now, or I'm going to solve it the way the student wants it solved. And, you know, it's very important that we emphasize temporarily because people get scared of Plan C and they think it's sort of the cardinal sin around challenging behavior because they think it is giving in. But I think it's really important to clarify what we talk about as Plan C is not giving in. Giving in is generally when you try to impose your will and you can't, and it gets ugly and you bail. That's what I call failed Plan A. Plan C is the educator, in this case, the adult, being in charge still and deciding, what am I prioritizing? What am I working on and what am I not? And for now, temporarily, I'm going to put something on the back burner, not because it isn't important, not because I don't want that student to meet that expectation, but because I got bigger fish to fry right now. So Plan C is a way to prioritize, which, by the way, is an important part of any behavior intervention plan or whatever you want to call it, making a game plan when it comes to helping a kid with behavior.
Just for clarity purposes, when I heard that and read it and felt it, temporarily dropping Plan C, dropping the expectation, means to me, if you sense that the child is shutting down or becoming emotionally heightened, am I right about that? Is that a good time to
Well, it can be, although what we'll talk about in a moment is this thing we call Plan B has a lot of calming elements to it as well.
Yes.
And you know, one of the main reasons we encourage people to practice collaboratively solving problems with kids is not just to solve the problem, not just to reduce the behavior, not just to build a relationship, because it does all those things, but also it's where you help kids practice, develop the skills that they're struggling with that are leading to that challenging behavior in the first place. So, for example, if a child gets worked up and shuts down or things like that, in other words, they have a hard time regulating their emotions, which is a skill, they need help practicing that. One of the ways we practice it is through the process of solving problems together. Now, there are times where, it gets too hot and you need to drop it for now. The only other thing I would point out, though, about these plans is the hardest time to figure out what plan you're going to use is right in the heat of the moment. And one of the fundamental truths when it comes to behavior is challenging behavior doesn't come out of the blue for no reason.
Yeah.
It happens in predictable circumstances where kids encounter problems that they struggle with the skills to handle well. So part of the beauty of that is if you can make a list of the predictable situations that lead to challenging behavior with a student, then you can think ahead and you can say, okay, on this list of 5 things that are happening each day, maybe there's 1 or 2 that I can put aside for now, proactively. So it's not that I need to wait till they escalate and they say, maybe it's not worth going there. I can actually avoid them entirely for now until we're ready to work on them later. So that's probably the most effective use of Plan C, in fact.
That helps, because what we really want the space we want to be in is in Plan B, where we're really solving the problem with our child at home or with our student.
Correct. And, people ask me all the time, so are you saying you should be doing Plan B all the time? And I say, well, look, it would be great if you could, but you can't. I mean, nobody can, especially not, a teacher in a classroom of 25 kids trying to teach the curriculum with all going on in a classroom. You can't do Plan B all the time over every problem. So you're going to have to pick your spots. And this is just a helpful way of knowing if you're not doing Plan B, you only got 2 other options, A or C.
Yeah.
And it's helpful because you can decide, hey, I want to do A because I need to get this expectation met my way come hell or high water. Or I'm going to choose to drop this because it's more important to me that I keep the student calm than I pursue this with them. So it's a simple way to make decisions. But I think the most important thing is be planful about it.
Yeah.
Decide ahead of time, including what we're going to talk about now is how do you do this thing called plan B? Well, guess what the worst time to do plan B is? Right when a predictable problem is happening. If it's predictable, catch the kid when you can carve out a minute or two of time and they're calm and accessible and you're prepared. It's going to make for much better problem solving.
Kids sometimes really do say things where they sound like an adult. You're like, wow, that just came out of this child's mouth and he's only 9 or 10. I handed back the goals that they had written, what I thought they had written, and with our little adjustments or whatnot. And with this tricky student, he said to me, those aren't my goals for me. Those are your goals for me. That's when you go, wow, that he could even articulate that. That's amazing. But there was something that went off a little bit in my brain. And I think this is what you're talking about when it comes to mindset. In it, there was kind of this little defense mechanism that went off in my head. Like, I've spent so much time in my teaching partner and I, because I'm always part-time, but we had a little laugh about it because we both felt like we were really, really trying to understand this student and go where he is. And he had a lot of challenging behavior. And part of you is just like, are you kidding? This is what you're going to say to me. But I recognized that little bit of defense that I was feeling inside. Yeah. And so what I said to him at the time was, you know what? I agree with you. Like, if you don't feel like these are your goals, that's not going to work for you. Then when I was trying to move into the solve collaboratively, like, let's stay in this spot, he was just shutting down. And so because I was aware of this and was really trying to apply what I heard you saying, I said, you know what, let's just take a break from this. I'm going to leave it on your desk. If you feel like you want to change this any way you want to change it, if you want to start over, if you want a new paper, let's do that. And that paper sat there all week. So that's why I'm saying when we temporarily go, okay, I had to drop the expectation for that week. And then what we ended up doing is we just brought both papers, the new one and the old one, out at conferences and said, Mom, would you want to let's talk together? And then all of us that's the beautiful part that I wanted to get to, is we collaborated as two teachers, a parent, and then he really was using his voice and speaking up about what he wanted to do at that point.
Well, look, I think it's a great example because, I mean, if you think about these 3 plans, right? Plan A would look like some version of you saying to him, well, you may be saying these are our goals and not your goals, but this is what we heard from you. These are the goals we came up with. So this is what we're running with. And whether you do that nicely or harshly, we'd call that plan A.
I've tried that before, by the way, and you're right, it doesn't work.
Well, and you did a version of plan C, it sounds like, where you were like, okay, you know what, let's drop this for now and we'll put this paper out here. And if you want to add to it, change it, they can be whatever the goals you think they ought to be. Okay. Now, plan B has a set of ingredients to it. So when we say collaborative problem solving, work together with a kid to solve a problem, we don't just sort of leave people on their own to do it. It's not a set of techniques you can use on somebody, but it's a set of guideposts that give you clear guidance about how to have this conversation. It's a structure to problem solving that is oriented at keeping kids calm, regulating them, helping them see the adult's perspective, and engaging in brainstorming aimed at solving a problem that also builds a whole bunch of skills as you do it. So, what we could do, Melanie, is I could sort of list out what those ingredients look like, and we could map them right onto the problem that you have to solve with that.
We do. If this is the recipe, we want the ingredients for sure.
All right, so let me tell you the ingredients. And like any good recipe, by the way, which I've learned the hard way, you have to use the ingredients in the right order. So there's only 3 ingredients, but you can't use them out of order. It won't go as well. It'll be different. Okay. The first ingredient we call the empathize ingredient. Okay. And one of the things I like to point out with that ingredient is that the goal there is you don't need to agree or disagree in order to empathize. Like, you could patently disagree with a kid. You could totally agree, or somewhere in between. You can still empathize, because empathy It means to understand. And so what I tell educators is your goal in that first ingredient, we call the empathy ingredient, is to understand. And what do I mean by understand? Understand the student's concern, perspective, point of view, what the student thinks about this problem to solve, or in some cases, what's hard about the situation or the problem. And what we teach educators to do is to ask a bunch of questions. If they're not getting much from the student, they could use some educated guessing as they try to be a detective to figure out what's going on. And if the student gives you any information, you reflect back in your own words, in essence, what you've heard from the student. And if they start to escalate or to shut down at any point in the process, you provide them some reassurance that this is not some tricky form of plan A.
Yeah.
And that you're really trying to understand where they're coming from. So in your case, that, basically I just listed 4 tools that you use in this first ingredient: questions, guesses, reflective listening, and reassurance. So in your case, when he, she, they say, those aren't my goals, those are your goals for me, I would go right to one of those 4 tools and I would say, I'd use reflective listening and I'd say, oh, whoa, so wait a second. You're saying those aren't your goals? Those are the goals that we have for you? All I did was reflect what he said.
Mm-hmm.
And if he says back, yeah, that's exactly what I said, I would probably throw in some reassurance. Whoa, hold on a second. Well, that doesn't sound very good, because if they're supposed to be goals for you, but they don't feel like your goals, that's not very good. I want to make sure I understand. Can you fill me in here? So what has you saying that those aren't your goals? And fill me in about what do you think is wrong with these goals? And I go into detective mode to try to drill down and gather information about their perspective or their point of view here. And the reason we start with the empathy ingredient, the first ingredient's got to be the first one in the recipe, is because empathy is regulating. Empathy is calming, being heard, being understood, being listened to. And you got to go up through the bottom of the brain first if you're going to eventually get to this kid's cortex, the smart part, and do some problem solving. So you regulate him first through empathy. You get to the bottom of his concern, his perspective. And only once you feel like you really understand it and you check in with him and say, have I got you now? Am I understanding where you're coming from?
Yeah.
If he says yes, then you can go to the second ingredient. And the second ingredient we call the share ingredient, because having identified his perspective or concern, the second ingredient is where you get to share your perspective, your concern. And for instance, if you didn't have any concerns here at all, and we're like, okay, hey, whatever your goals are, great, let's write those down. You should be doing plan C. But if you have a perspective, you have concerns, as his teacher say, I actually think I have some things to add to these goals here too that could be helpful. Right. This is your point to raise your concern. Now, we always point out to people, this is not where you raise your solution to the problem, but your perspective, your concern, what's important to you. And the reason I was doing this with my hands, Melanie, is I tell people all the time, this is how you know what plan you're doing. Because if you only have one set of concerns on the table and it's the adults, you're headed for plan A. If you only have one set and it's the child's, you're headed for plan C. Mm-hmm. The way to know that you're headed for plan B is you must have both sets of concerns on the table. You get the kids on the table, you share yours, and if you got both and they're still with you, you go to that the third ingredient of this process, which is basically an invitation to brainstorm together. It's where you say to them, all right, so I wonder what we can do to solve this problem in a way that's going to work for both of us, that will address both of our perspectives and concerns. And in your case, it would be trying to come up with a list of goals that the student felt like, okay, yeah, that's my goals. And as the educator, you were saying, and it reflects in my view some of the things I think are important as your teacher to be working on as well. And we always say any solution that's mutually satisfactory, addresses both concerns, is realistic and doable, is a good solution. And the cool thing about collaborative problem solving is if you listen really hard to a student, guess what? They're going to be much more likely to listen hard to you afterwards when you move to the second ingredient to share your perspective. And a good friend and colleague, Dr. Bruce Perry, he has coined this sort of rubric that he says, it goes like this: regulate, relate, reason. You must regulate somebody before they're going to relate to you, before you can reason with them. And that sort of reflects how our brains process information, the sequence with which our brains process information. This recipe that we were just talking through is a way to operationalize that. First ingredient is regulating a kid, understanding them, their concern, their perspective. Second ingredient, relating to them, asking them to understand your perspective. Third ingredient is now saying, you know what, let's do some reasoning. Let's do some problem solving. And if at any point in that process, ingredient 1, 2, 3, the student becomes dysregulated, just go right back to the first ingredient, the empathy ingredient, to re-regulate them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the recipe, and that's why you do it in that order.
What do you think about this? I will do this in written form, meaning we're still kind of having the back and forth, but she's writing it and she's writing her feelings and writing her questions, kind of like almost like a journal write that goes back and forth.
Yeah. Absolutely. Look, whatever's going to work. And we'll go back to what we said earlier, that when this isn't going so well, it's about skill, not will. And some kids, it's a lot easier for them to communicate in other ways than spoken word back and forth. I had a kid I worked with in my clinical practice who really wouldn't communicate much at all with me around these problems I was trying to solve with him and his parents. Until we started texting one another, sitting in the same room with each other. And he would text me all kinds of information. And frankly, it started with just emojis and mostly the poop emoji, but it moved on quickly from there to him actually typing words, and he'd fill me in about his perspective that way. Fine, whatever it takes. Younger kids, maybe it's play. There's all kinds of creative ways, but the goals are still the same.
Will you talk about some of the mistakes that we do make sometimes? And you've mentioned some of them, but just in staying in that sweet spot of plan B.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for us adults to sort of bite our tongue on what we feel are going to be good solutions to problems. And frankly, especially educators, because educators have seen so many problems, right? Like when they're having a problem solving conversation with a kid, they're basically thinking to themselves, look, I've seen this problem 742 times already. I know some good ways to solve it. And I don't have much time here. Can we just speed up? But it's absolutely crucial for many reasons that kids be co-authors of solutions for investment, for autonomy, for skill building. So I think one big thing that we do is we rush to the finish line too quickly. We have a hard time holding back on our own solutions. And so we end up sort of doing something that I call sort of tricky plan A, which means we sort of listen to the kid some, but then end up sort of subtly imposing our will. And collaborative problem solving is not just collaborating with kids to solve problems, because you can collaborate with a kid to solve a problem the way you want. That's not collaborative problem solving. Collaborative problem solving is collaborating with a kid to solve a problem in a way that works for both of you all. And I think that's the biggest challenge, frankly.
And I'll say this because I think this is true for many of us in education, that when I make mistakes this way, it is the time factor. It really is. It's
Absolutely.
like, oh my gosh, they're leaving for music in 5 minutes and we got to get this going. And whenever I make the mistakes, it's like, I do feel rushed.
Absolutely. And it's a great reminder. If you have 5 minutes before music to do this, and you're 2 minutes in and you're still trying to understand, unpack the kid's concern, if you speed up and you don't quite know the kid's concern, but you speed up because you know yours, you're going to end up with a solution that addresses yours and not theirs, i.e. plan A. So it's much better to, even if you have to take that whole 5 minutes just to get their concern on the table, press pause and say, you know what, I'm going to need to catch you later because we got to go to music. The conversation doesn't have to happen in one fell swoop. You can have it in multiple iterations. Now, understandably, most educators are like, hey, I just don't have that much time, because that's a reality, right? It's the most scarce resource in our schools is time. But let's be clear that challenging behavior is taking up the most time of all of us, and time away from teaching the curriculum, not just for that student, but for all the students. So, finding these 2, 3, 4, 5 minute pockets to do problem solving is going to be time well spent. It's going to save time once you get going.
Oh, yeah.
But, we have to do it for academics as well, to individualize instruction as well. So it's a challenge. Systemically, schools and leaders that find ways to sort of prioritize how to free educators to have these small conversations is very important. You can also have these conversations during class. You can do what we call group plan B, which is group problem solving with a whole. So there's a whole bunch of ways to be able to make this, practical and reasonable within the challenging environment that is a school.
Well, and the group collaborating is nice because you can meet a specific need, even if it's only happening with one student, but when you're getting the ideas and brainstorming with all of the other kids, they feel the energy of it and they're like, all of a sudden, this is a cool thing we're talking about instead of something really negative. Like we're actually having some momentum in the classroom and coming up with ideas of how do we solve this? Everyone's coming in late from recess. Let's talk about it.
It becomes their problem as well. Instead of it's my problem as the teacher that I've got to come up with a solution and see if you're going to comply with the solution. If you all are generating the solutions, you're going to be much more invested in seeing them through. And if it doesn't work, also troubleshooting from there. So group plan B is a very powerful way of using this approach as well.
Really, it's a shift in our minds of just being really open to a new way or a new approach.
Yeah, I think mindset's huge. I mean, if I tried to sort of sum it up for you here, hold on tight to the notion that students do well if they can, that all students want to do well.
All students want to do well.
Exactly. And if they're struggling, it's about skill, not will. Skills like problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance. And then be aware, you got three options: plan A, plan B, plan C. And if you're going to do plan B, the most important thing is be curious, not judgmental. Don't rush to judge, slow down, be curious. That's absolutely critical in this process.
Thank you. All of this is so good and so helpful. I just have to ask this because it's been one that we've seen.
Understandably, most educators are like, hey, I just don't have that much time, because that's a reality, right? It's the most scarce resource in our schools is time. But let's be clear that challenging behavior is taking up the most time of all of us, and time away from teaching the curriculum, not just for that student, but for all the students. So, finding these 2, 3, 4, 5-minute pockets to do problem solving is going to be time well spent. It's going to save time once you get going. We have to do it for academics as well, to individualize instruction as well. So it's a challenge. Systemically, schools and leaders that find ways to sort of prioritize how to free educators to have these small conversations is very important. You can also have these conversations during class. You can do what we call group plan B, which is group problem solving with a whole. So there's a whole bunch of ways to be able to make this, practical and reasonable within the challenging environment that is a school.
Well, and the group collaborating is nice because you can meet a specific need, even if it's only happening with one student, but when you're getting the ideas and brainstorming with all of the other kids, they feel the energy of it and they're like, all of a sudden, this is a cool thing we're talking about instead of something really negative. Like we're actually having some momentum in the classroom and coming up with ideas of how do we solve this? Everyone's coming in late from recess. Let's talk about it.
It becomes their problem as well. Instead of it's my problem as the teacher that I've got to come up with a solution and see if you're going to comply with the solution. If you all are generating the solutions, you're going to be much more invested in seeing them through. And if it doesn't work, also troubleshooting from there. So group plan B is a very powerful way of using this approach as well.
Really, it's a shift in our minds of just being really open to a new way or a new approach or the same approach, just a different form.
Yeah, I think mindset's huge. I mean, if I tried to sort of sum it up for you here, hold on tight to the notion that students do well if they can, that all students want to do well.
All students want to do well.
Exactly. And if they're struggling, it's about skill, not will. Skills like problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance. And then be aware, you got three options: plan A, plan B, plan C. And if you're going to do plan B, the most important thing is be curious, not judgmental. Don't rush to judge, slow down, be curious. That's absolutely critical in this process. Whatever you're trying to help anybody change, in this case, we're talking about challenging behavior. The biggest predictor of whether you're going to be successful trying to be helpful is the degree of helping relationship you have with the person you're trying to help. And empathy is the foundation of really all relationship building when it comes to a helping relationship.
Thank you. All of this is so good and so helpful. Will you leave us with like the good hope of all these kids that you've worked with from all over the world? What's the big hope that you can give parents or any educator that feels a little discouraged by dealing with so much behavior that's tricky?
Yeah. Well, look, I would say, first of all, I've never met a kid who hasn't been able to develop some of the skills that they're struggling with that are leading to some of their most challenging behaviors. And I always like to remind people that when we're talking about skill building, we're literally talking about changing the brain. We're talking about building new pathways in the brain. And, basic science tells us if you're going to do that, it's all about repetition. It's all about repetition. So it doesn't happen overnight. Okay.
Yeah.
But look, a lot of these kids who really struggle with challenging behavior, they make really cool adults. And I often say to teachers and parents, our job is to help them sort of survive their childhood with their self-esteem intact, feeling good about themselves, because they're going to make some pretty cool adults out there. And some of these kids are exactly the kind of people who end up sort of changing the world for the better.
Oh, absolutely. And it's kids like that that will speak up, advocate for themselves, and have that challenging time where you think, I really want to know what they're going to be doing in their life, 20 years from now or whatnot.
Exactly.
Yeah, you've given us so much good stuff today. I hope that everyone listening can take this in, take it into your home, take it into your classroom, because these 3 plans and really getting to plan B and working together, it creates it's not magical, but it does feel magical when you really go through the process and feel like you're getting somewhere. So thank you, Stuart Ablon. You are amazing, really incredible with people and helping kids. Will you describe, just before we sign off, about your Think Kids? Is this what you do around the country? You go into schools?
Yeah, sure. So Think Kids is the program that I have the privilege of directing at Massachusetts General Hospital here in Boston, but we do work all over the world. And we work with everybody from parents to schools to treatment settings, all kinds of places. Most of our work is focused in schools these days, and we help schools learn this collaborative problem-solving approach and implement it in one classroom, one school at a time, or in some cases, entire districts as well. So if people are interested, you can find us on the web. Again, the program's called Think Kids. It's at thinkkids.org, and we have trainings open to the public on a regular basis, delivered remotely, but all kinds of other supports in place as well. So thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to be able to share our work like this. And things are pretty challenging out there right now in our schools. So I'm really hoping this can be helpful.
Thank you so much. I will put all of those links at the end. Again, it's Think Kids by Dr. Stuart Ablon. Thank you so much. And stay warm there in Boston.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Thanks for being part of today's class. To submit a question or topic for further episodes, please email elementary.schooled@outlook.com. School is out for today, but please remember, when we strengthen a child, we strengthen society.